They wouldn't have wanted that for me, but my parents never went anywhere. My father probably thought the capital of the world was where.
The 1960s folk scene was a dream for many. Acoustic guitars, protest songs, and voices that demanded change filled coffeehouses and festivals across America. But behind the peaceful songs and powerful lyrics, there were rivalries, jealousy, and betrayal. And in the center of it all stood Bob Dylan. Dylan, the voice of a generation, saw everything, the good and the ugly. He admired some, clashed with others, and never stayed silent when he felt betrayed. Today, we dive into the shocking truth. The folk heroes Dylan thought were fakes, frauds, and, in his own words, jerks. When Dylan first arrived in Greenwich Village in the early 1960s, the folk scene looked warm and welcoming. But beneath the surface, competition was fierce. Singers battled for stage time in smoky coffee houses, each trying to outshine the other. Dylan noticed that many artists weren't singing for the cause of justice, but for their own egos. Some mocked newcomers, others sabotaged sets. Dylan later said it felt like a shark tank dressed in flannel. He realized early on that some so-called folk purists weren't there for truth. They were there to be stars, and they treated him like an outsider. The folk purists wanted rules. Acoustic guitars only, no drums, no electricity, and definitely no rock and roll. Dylan hated these walls. Music to him was about freedom. Yet many in the scene treated him as a traitor the moment he began experimenting. He recalled how older folk singers whispered about him, calling him fake and commercial. Instead of celebrating his innovation, they turned cold. Dylan later admitted these purists were some of the biggest jerks of all. They preached freedom and change, but demanded everyone stay inside their box. Hypocrisy was everywhere, and Dylan had no patience for it. One of the most famous stories is about Pete Seeger, the folk giant many called the scene's father. At the 1965 Newport Folk Festival, Dylan went electric, shocking the crowd. Booing erupted, and the legend says Seeger grabbed an axe, wanting to cut the power cables. Seeger denied it later, saying he just wanted the sound fixed. But the story stuck. For Dylan, the reaction from Seeger and his followers was a betrayal. The man he respected most had turned into a gatekeeper. Dylan saw this as proof. Even folk's biggest heroes could act like jerks when their rules were broken. Many singers in Greenwich Village weren't thrilled about Dylan's fast rise. He came out of nowhere and quickly became the face of folk music. Some older singers who had been grinding for years couldn't stand it. They whispered that Dylan stole songs, that he was just a copycat. The jealousy was ugly. Dylan remembered feeling like some singers wanted him to fail more than they wanted the movement to succeed. Instead of supporting one of their own, they tried to drag him down. For Dylan, this kind of bitterness was the worst kind of betrayal in a scene built on unity. Joan Baez helped bring Dylan to the big stage, often inviting him to perform with her. But as Dylan's fame grew, their relationship became strained. Baez wanted him to stay true to protest songs, but Dylan wanted to explore everything: love songs, surreal poetry, electric rock. When Dylan drifted, Baez felt abandoned, and she wasn't shy about criticizing him. Dylan, on the other hand, felt she was pressuring him to live her vision instead of his. Their falling out was messy and very public. To Dylan, Baez wasn't a villain, but the pressure she applied felt unfair, and yes, a bit jerk-like. Dylan's appearance at folk festivals became legendary, but also dangerous. Some organizers adored him, others resented him. After Newport 1965, festival stages became battlegrounds. Critics booed him, audiences heckled him, and old friends turned their backs. Dylan once joked that he couldn't tell if people came to hear him play or to watch him fail. He saw how quickly admiration could turn to jealousy. Many in the scene acted like saints on stage, singing about peace, but off stage they spread rumors and insults. Dylan exposed the truth. Even folk festivals, symbols of unity, were filled with petty grudges and jerks. Phil Ochs was another folk star who had a complicated friendship with Dylan. At first they respected each other deeply, but Ochs criticized Dylan's music when he turned electric, saying he was selling out. Dylan, furious, threw Aux out of his limousine once, shouting, "You're not a folk singer, you're a journalist." Their relationship never healed. Dylan later admitted that Aux was talented, but couldn't see past his own bitterness. For Dylan, this was another painful example. The folk scene wasn't just about music. It was about ego battles that sometimes destroyed friendships. Dylan grew frustrated with folk singers who acted like prophets on stage but lived nothing like the values they preached. Some sang about poverty while living comfortably. Others preached honesty while stabbing fellow musicians in the back. Dylan once said that some singers were playing characters more than songs. He saw the hypocrisy and wanted no part of it. To him, these were the biggest jerks, people who used change as a marketing tool. Folk was supposed to mean truth, but Dylan realized many of its stars were wearing masks. That's why he walked away. By the late 1960s, Dylan had distanced himself from the folk scene entirely. He didn't want to be part of a club filled with rules, jealousy, and hypocrisy. Instead, he carved his own path: rock, blues, country, gospel, whatever inspired him. Folk singers called him a traitor, a sellout, a fake. But Dylan didn't care. He once said, "I was never part of any folk scene, I just happened to be there." To him, the jerks could keep their coffeehouse wars. He had bigger things to do, like changing the entire landscape of popular music forever. Looking back, Dylan's clashes with the folk scene weren't just personal grudges. They revealed deeper truths about the music industry. Every scene has its saints and its jerks. Dylan exposed that behind the peace signs and protest anthems, folk had its dark side: jealousy, ego, and betrayal. But by walking away, Dylan proved something bigger. True artists don't let rules or critics decide their path. The folk scene may have had its jerks, but Dylan came out stronger, freer, and more influential than anyone else. And that, perhaps, is why his voice still echoes louder than theirs. The press loved drama, and Dylan was their perfect headline. When folk singers clashed, reporters exaggerated it, painting Dylan as a villain who had betrayed the movement. Journalists twisted his words, fueling anger between him and the so-called purists. Dylan once complained that newspapers didn't care about music, they cared about conflict. By exaggerating the booing at Newport or printing insults from rival singers, the media made the scene look nastier than it really was. Dylan realized the press wanted to create heroes and villains, and he often found himself cast as the bad guy. For him, the real jerks weren't only in the folk clubs, they were also holding pens in newsrooms. Instead of wasting energy arguing with critics or fighting folk purists, Dylan answered them with music. Albums like Highway 61 Revisited and Blonde on Blonde showed the world that he didn't need approval from the folk gatekeepers. He fused poetry, surrealism, and rock in a way no one had ever done before. The same people who called him a sellout couldn't deny his genius. Dylan's revenge was simple: keep moving forward. Every time someone tried to box him in, he broke out with a new sound. In the end, the so-called jerks fueled his greatest creativity. By the end of the 1960s, the folk scene that once looked so powerful began to fade. Many of the loudest voices against Dylan lost their spotlight. Rock bands took over, protest songs sounded less fresh, and the coffeehouses lost their magic. Dylan, meanwhile, was still standing, still evolving. The same singers who once mocked him were now forgotten by most listeners. Dylan didn't need to expose them anymore. Time did the job for him. To many fans, the biggest jerks of the folk scene weren't just those who attacked Dylan. They were the ones who couldn't adapt, who let bitterness bury their music. When we look back at Dylan's battles in the 1960s folk scene, the lesson is clear: art is bigger than rules. Dylan exposed the jerks not by calling them out directly, but by showing the world a better way. He taught us that true creativity means breaking barriers, not protecting them. The folk purists who fought him proved that jealousy and hypocrisy exist even in movements built on peace and truth. Dylan's story reminds us that legends are made by courage, not by fitting in. And that's why, Even today, Bob Dylan's voice drowns out the noise of his critics.